Well, as advertised, our speaker today, Beatrice Golomb, MD, PhD, is a professor of medicine at the UCSD School of Medicine. She has a background in physics, engineering at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, biology, which her PhD is in, medicine. She's an MD and was chief medical resident. And research methods, she was a RAND, UCLA, Robert Woods Johnson clinical scholar. Her laboratory focuses on exposure and conditions tied to oxidation, antioxidation, and cell energetics. Dr. Golomb was the first to seriously document evidence of her theoried source for the cause of the mysterious illness in US diplomats in Cuba and China, and the first to publish a peer-reviewed article on this. She has presented this work to the Cuban National Academy of Sciences and the US Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, whose report, December 2020, agreed with her conclusion. We are pleased as punch to have her speak for us today, and we hear that she lives for Q&A, so she will gleefully stay after to answer your questions. Please welcome Dr. Golomb.
As advertised, I will be speaking today on Diplomats' mystery illness and pulse radiofrequency microwave radiation. This has also been termed Havana syndrome. Next slide. So in latter 2017, we began hearing news reports that U.S. diplomats and their family members in Havana, Cuba, had been experiencing strange episodes in which unusual sounds were heard, often accompanied by ear pain and followed by development of myriad symptoms, such as headache, cognitive problems, sleep problems, tinnitus or ringing ears, dizziness, irritability, and anxiety. These were characterized in the media as sonic attacks, presumably because of the concurrence of sounds being heard and auditory-related symptoms like ear pain, tinnitus, and for some people, hearing loss. Next slide. So what is the basis of the case for radiofrequency radiation? And it rests on several pillars: specific characters of the sounds heard, the clinical features, the symptoms and signs reported by individuals, precedent for past exposure of U.S. diplomats to microwave radiation in a foreign embassy setting, actual measurement of high levels of radiofrequency radiation, known mechanisms by which this radiation can cause the symptoms and noises that were produced, and comparison to other proper hypotheses, none of which do a near equivalent job of explaining the evidence. Next slide. So sound versus radiation, what is the difference? I've noticed that a lot of people confuse these, and this is understandable since both travel in waves and both are measured in cycles per second or hertz. Both are used in medical imaging. We have things like X-rays and CT scans, which are radiation, and ultrasound, which is sound waves. But in fact, these are very different kinds of waves. Sound waves are pressure waves, so the direction of variation is in the direction of travel, whereas electromagnetic radiation are what are called transverse waves. The direction of variation is perpendicular to the direction of travel. So all electromagnetic radiation, as mentioned, is characterized by its frequency in cycles per second, and the arrow shows the many kinds of radiation that are sort of chopped somewhat arbitrarily into bins that are given names. Some of these you will be familiar with, like visible light. At the very low end, we have extremely low frequency radiation, which is like the 60 hertz power line radiation that you have going through your home. And then as we get to higher frequencies, we got radio frequency radiation, then infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray. So radio frequency radiation is a quite broad swath of frequencies from 3,000 to 300 billion cycles a second. And microwaves are the upper part of the radio frequency range from 300 million to 300 billion cycles per second. So all microwaves are radio waves, but not the converse. Another big difference between electromagnetic radiation and sound is that all electromagnetic radiation, regardless of the frequency, travels at the same speed, the speed of light, and of course sound travels at the speed of sound, so this is the difference between the speed of lightning and the speed of thunder. But even though sound and radiation are different things, there are selective settings in which radiation can produce the perception of sound. This is a phenomenon that's sometimes called the Frey effect or microwave auditory effect or radiofrequency hearing. This occurs only in a restricted set of frequencies from 2.4 million to 10 billion cycles per second. And it only occurs for radiation that's pulsed. That is to say, it stops and starts, stops and starts, stops and starts, often, by the way, millions of times a second. The main theory about how radiation with these properties produces sound or perception of sound is the so-called thermoelastic theory. Just like your microwave oven heats things up, so this radio frequency or microwave radiation leads to minuscule rises in temperature in the head on the order of a millionth of a degree, and this sets up pressure waves that are then sensed by the cochlea or the ear, and thereafter processed by the brain just as though they were normal sounds. So they sound for all purposes like regular sounds. Well, the good news is that quote sound or noises that are produced by radiation have some different characteristics than noises that are produced by sound waves. Next slide. And we can compare the characteristics reported by diplomats for the sounds heard as in terms of how they are a fit to radio frequency versus sound waves. So first off, different diplomats reported different sounds. And if there were a common sound source, the sound would sound similar to everyone as long as they didn't have hearing loss. But for radio frequency radiation-induced noises, the same stimulus produces a different perception because the character of the sound heard depends on pulse characteristics but also on head dimensions, which differ for different people. The specific character of the noises that were reported encompassed chirping and clanging and clicking and grinding and hissing. There is no reason why it would be these sounds if it were sound waves, but these are exactly the spectrum of sounds that are known to be produced by this Frey effect, this radio frequency-induced noise. The third feature is that it was reported that these sounds, quote unquote, were perceived essentially exclusively at night. Now, actual sound sources can be heard day or night with or without ambient noise, but this Frey effect can only be heard in settings of very low ambient noise, such as in the deep of night. A fourth characteristic is that media reported that these sounds had so-called laser-like localization in space, which was said to, quote, defy known physics. So with the Frey effect, if you step outside the path of radiation, the sound goes away. You step back in the path, the sound comes back. Of course, laser-like localization does not defy the physics of electromagnetic radiation. Radio frequency radiation is electromagnetic radiation and can have this laser-like specificity. Analogously, if one person is in the path of radiation and someone else is outside the path, then two people who are quite close to each other, one can hear the sound and the other may not. And this was also reported with the diplomats, where one individual would hear a loud noise and someone in, quote, the immediate vicinity, unquote, would hear nothing. The fifth characteristic that we can compare is that sounds were reported to follow people as they move. Now, if you walk in the path of radiation, this Frey effect, this radio frequency-induced sound persists. And since it's produced inside the head, it's often perceived, by the way, as coming from just behind the head, or for some people just above or inside the head. But whichever that location is for that individual, it's independent of where they are relative to the origin of the radio frequency. So it seems to follow people where they move. Sound waves do not seem to follow people when they move. In fact, we have something in the brain called the superior olivary nuclei that help us to localize the place where sound is coming from. And finally, a number of diplomats reported that they had attempted to cover their ears or head, and this had led to no diminution in the apparent intensity of the sound. Now, if these were actual sound waves, pressure waves, this would lead to reduced intensity, but it does not for radio frequency-induced sound. And in fact, if there's any ambient noise to be further reduced, it can even lead to intensification of the sound. So each of these features that were reported in the media because they were distinctive and unexpected are a fit, indeed an expectation, a prediction of radio frequency radiation. None is expected or predicted with sound waves, and several of these features are frankly incompatible with sound. In fact, there isn't any other thing that is known to produce noises with these features except for pulsed radio frequency / microwave radiation. And I say radio frequency / microwave, this occurs within a part of the radio frequency range that includes a part of the microwave range. Next slide. So the next sort of pillar of the argument relates to the symptoms that were reported by the diplomats and how they compare to symptoms that are known to arise in people who get toxicity from radiation. And just like with every other potentially toxic exposure, whether it be peanuts or penicillin or fat and cholesterol-lowering drugs, there are some individuals who will experience toxicity at much lower exposure levels than others, that will have problems with exposures that others have no problems with. And there is a literature about these people, and we can compare the fraction reporting each of a set of symptoms among those with sensitivity to non-ionizing radiation, radiofrequency radiation, to the fraction of the same symptoms that were reported in Diplomats. So we're looking at two different papers here, one that looked at electrosensitivity, one that looked at Diplomats. The electrosensitivity paper came several years before the other one, so it can't have been influenced by the Diplomats experience. And we see they're very close concordance, not just in the nature of the symptoms reported, but in the quantitative profile. 81% headache compared to 81% headache. 81% cognitive problems compared to 81% having cognitive problems. Sleep problems, 86%, 76%. Dizziness, 62, 64. Tinnitus, 57, 63. Irritability, 67, 56. Anxiety, 57, 55. So for every symptom that was elicited in common across the two studies, there's very, very tight concordance. It turns out that there isn't any other known exposure or condition that produces these symptoms in this distribution. Now, many other things that cause symptoms by the same mechanisms that radiation causes problems, oxidative stress, and damage to the energy powerhouses of cells called mitochondria, can produce each of these symptoms, but each has its own distinctive profile. So radiofrequency radiation makes its way into the brain through the skull. There's no skull barrier at the point of the ear, so auditory symptoms like tinnitus are particularly prominent relative to other such exposures. Also, radiation depresses levels of melatonin, which is important for sleep. And it depresses those not equally in everybody, but in the people in whom it depresses them, you also lose those antioxidant protections of melatonin. So these tend to be the same people who develop symptoms. So sleep problems are particularly prominent with this source of that mechanism, radiation, compared to others of these conditions. So they produce their own distinctive profile. And for example, organophosphate pesticides, statin cholesterol-lowering drugs that can also produce toxicity to these common mechanisms have prominent muscle symptoms, which radiofrequency radiation does not. So again, the symptoms essentially compel electromagnetic radiation as the cause. Next slide. So in addition to symptoms which are subjective, we can look at signs, which are things that are potentially objectively measurable, although it wasn't in all cases the case that they were objectively measured. And we can see that these are also a fit between Diplomats and those with electrosensitivity, those who experience problems with radiofrequency and sometimes other forms of radiation. We don't have any study that elicited these signs in a common way for Diplomats and for electrosensitive individuals, so we can't compare them quantitatively, but we can see that they are a fit in terms, they're a match in terms of what the signs are: hearing loss, vision problems, speech and balance problems, nosebleed, brain swelling, damage to white matter, the myelin sheaths that allow fidelity and timing of brain cell signaling. In both cases, studies reported that brain imaging looked like traumatic brain injury, or TBI, and in both cases it was reported that some had in fact had past head injury, but not all had done so. So the signs are also a fit with radiofrequency radiation. Next slide. There's also precedent for past exposure of U.S. diplomats to microwave radiation in a U.S. embassy setting, specifically at the Moscow embassy from the early 1950s to the latter 1980s or 1990s, depending on the source. And so what was the reason for this radiation? Well, the hypotheses then were really similar to what the hypotheses would be now. One was intentional harm. A second was surveillance. A third, actually put forth by the Russians, they said they weren't trying to surveil us, but were jamming our surveillance device on the roof of our embassy building. But there had to have been at least some surveillance involved, because we know that there were microwave-activated listening devices planted by the Russians, including one in a carving of the Great Seal given to Ambassador Avril Harriman. I understand that that listening device now reposes in the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Shown here is a picture of Ambassador Walter Stossel, who threatened to resign unless the State Department personnel were told that they were being microwaved, and he went on to die of leukemia, a cancer type that has been tied in many studies to radiofrequency radiation. And incidentally, a number of the other personnel there ultimately developed leukemia as well, a small fraction, but still a good number. Next slide. So this evidence, in my view, was completely compelling, indeed conclusive for radiofrequency radiation being the source of the so-called Havana syndrome before there was any evidence that anyone had attempted to measure it or had documented high levels of radiofrequency. But in fact, it came out that one of the affected Foreign Service personnel in Guangzhou, China, where reports came out in April of 2018 that individuals were also affected, had actually secured a so-called commercial off-the-shelf or COTS Trifield 100 XE meter, and found that the readings went off the top of the meter, which meant that the measured radio frequency was in excess of 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared, which makes it exceed safety limits worldwide. In fact, this is 100 times the safety limit for sustained exposure in China. So they photographed the readings, brought in the meter and the readings, which were confiscated, and they were told that these were now classified, but the mom of the individuals was one of those affected and was not sort of subject to these classification requirements, and that's how we know about this now. They were incidentally medevaced out within 24 hours after their health problems had previously been dismissed. Next slide. So what is the source? As we've alluded to in the Moscow setting, leading theories would be surveillance or weaponry. Much less likely are the kinds of commercial communication devices, such as those that affect civilians, although these could be responsible in some of the scattered cases that have been reported around the world since the Havana and Guangzhou, China episodes. So regarding surveillance, there's well-known so-called TTW, or through-the-wall surveillance, which you can read about in reports from the National Institute of Justice or the ACLU. It's in use by police departments and three-letter agencies in the U.S. and around the world. And you can use something called Y-Hear type technology to do auditory surveillance with this. By the way, this can go through any wall material, including concrete, except for metal. And in fact, it might also be surveillance seeking to secure information from people's electronic devices, and there are reasons to think that might perhaps be more likely in this instance. Electronic weapons have been in development for decades. Certainly we have information about this from the Soviet Union, with articles dating back to the latter 1990s, already talking about former microwave weapon systems by the Soviet Union, primarily to take out electronic devices. But microwaves have also been weaponized, including through the so-called active denial system used for crowd control in the U.S., although that uses much higher frequencies that are intended to primarily affect the skin and cause burning, and would not, by the way, cause the fray effect. But they also would be less expected to cause the other symptoms because the high frequency penetrates less deeply. Next slide. So what mechanism could be responsible for the health problems produced by radiofrequency radiation? And the answer is oxidative stress, that kind of free radical injury that antioxidants help to protect against. There is abundant evidence that oxidative stress is caused by radiofrequency radiation, including an article by Jackie Menke and colleagues that found that 100 articles had each examined whether low-intensity radiofrequency radiation caused oxidative stress, and 93 of these 100 studies had found that it did. So there's extensive replication of evidence that oxidative stress is implicated, caused by radiofrequency radiation, and there's masses of evidence that oxidative stress in turn causes a number of downstream mechanisms: damage to the energy powerhouses of cells called mitochondria, damage to membranes, alteration in voltage-gated ion channels that reside in membranes and are important for the health of cells and also for signaling, alterations in blood flow, increases in inflammation, increases in cell death, autoimmune activation. Oxidative stress modifies things in the body in a way that makes them subject to autoimmune attack, and also damage to the so-called blood-brain barrier, or BBB, that helps to protect the brain from intrusion of toxic chemicals. So radiofrequency radiation causes oxidative stress, which causes all of these, and there's also literature directly tying radiofrequency radiation to each of these downstream mechanisms. Each of these, in turn, can contribute to health problems. And in fact, oxidative stress and the closely intertwined phenomenon of mitochondrial injury are known to produce each of the symptoms that are reported in the Diplomats. Next slide. So evidence that radiofrequency radiation can cause toxicity is not new. You may see some reports promoted by injury, that only ionizing radiation, which is in the higher frequency end of the range, can cause problems. But again, there's abundant evidence that radiofrequency radiation causes damage not by ionization, but by oxidative stress. And reports of health problems and toxic biological mechanisms with radiofrequency date back on the order of 100 years, including multiple reports by U.S. government agencies. So this is not fringe science. So for example, 1931 Navy report, these are just a tiny fraction, by the way, of reports. 1972 Navy report by the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, by NASA, and by the Air Force. And the Air Force report cited here, which is entitled radiofrequency / microwave biological effects, so it's focused on radiofrequency radiation, states, quote, experimental evidence has shown that exposure to low intensity radiation can have a profound effect on biological processes. So this type of radiation, it was acknowledged, can have a profound effect on biological processes. Next slide. So how does this hypothesis stack up against the other hypotheses that have been put forth to account for so-called Havana syndrome, or as the government is now calling them, anomalous health incidents? So we can look at these key characteristics, specifics of the noises, symptoms, signs, precedent, measurement, and biological mechanisms. And as we saw, each of these are a fit for RF, but none are really a fit for any of the other things. Sonic hypothesis can explain the existence of sounds, but as we saw, the specific characteristics of the sounds are not a fit for sonic sources. They don't produce sound that follows people or is tightly localized in space, or that fails to attenuate when you cover your ears. The mass hysteria hypothesis falls short on many grounds. First off, there actually isn't any meaningful evidence that mass hysteria ever causes chronic health problems. There is no known mechanism that would be responsible for such a thing, much less a test to see if such a mechanism is operating. And the fact that there's a fit in terms of quantitative symptoms across individuals, which fraction of individuals reported this symptom versus that symptom compared to radiofrequency radiation, that could not be produced by social contagion unless people were working closely together for the purpose of intentionally producing those fractions of symptoms. The effects of stress are well known and are not a match to this. The organophosphate hypothesis is perhaps the closest to being compatible, since organophosphate pesticides, which are the favored hypothesis for Canadian diplomats, do also cause these same mechanisms, oxidative stress and mitochondrial impairment, but the symptoms of organophosphate toxicity don't match the profile. Again, much more prominent muscle symptoms, much less prominent auditory and sleep problems, and on top of this would not account for the noises. And finally, there's the viral hypothesis that also can't account for the noise, nor the quantitative distribution of symptoms. So the RF hypothesis has extensive specificity and triangulation, and it's the only hypothesis that is a fit when you look at specifics to any, much less all, of these features. So essentially, in my view at least, the evidence really compels the conclusion that pulse radiofrequency / microwave radiation is the cause. And of course, this has implications for the rest of us who are exposed to radiofrequency radiation, but that's not the subject of this talk. Next slide. And I'd like to thank you all for your kind attention.